for our next panel, we'll got to have the honor of having some distinguished folks with us. First to my right here is Alex Courtney. Well, let me back up a second. I'm running ahead of myself. My name is Christian Braga. I'm the CEO for Elected Officials Protect America. I'm also a 20-year veteran, served 20 years in the Air Force, and had the pleasure of spending at least 2 years in the deserts in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, as well as Qatar. So I understand, well, thank you. And so understand national security and how energy plays into that, or how energy influences our national security. So that's what this next panel is about, is energy and national security. And as I said, a couple of distinguished folks here with us today. Alex Dagher is a former Maine state rep, getting tongue-tied. Also a former Marine and currently a Navy Reserve officer serving in public affairs. And now a co-founder of EOPA. To his right is Igor Triga. Igor is a former, and forgive me, Igor, if I mess this up, is a former Rent Board director for Berkeley, also a native of Ukraine. And to his right is, I think we have met him already, but Philip Williams, who is a council member from the Yurok tribe in Humboldt County. He is also Army veteran, if I'm correct, Army veteran. So again, energy and national security, you're probably thinking, well, hey, we came for one thing, how does that connect to the conversations we've been having thus far? How does that connect, sir, to building that trust and understanding what is going on? So the primary question here is how does energy and national security connect to the climate crisis? How does that contribute? How is that part of that conversation around the climate crisis and the need to transition away from business as we've been doing? How do we move into a more modern way, new technology, and in particular, renewable energy solutions that are climate friendly and climate positive? And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panel. First up is Alex Dagher.
Thank you, Christian.
Oh, there we go. I was trying to keep that one silent to keep the Air Force out of trouble. However, when we do think about it, we're all one team at the DoD working together to fight the climate crisis. And this is not a new thing. The Department of Defense, going back to the Obama administration, has been very focused on the security threats of climate change. And it's become even more prevalent now, where the Navy is actually dedicating $718 million directly to combat climate change. It's not new that we have funding out there to combat the effects of it, but the volume of it still a drop in the bucket compared to the DoD budget. But the fact that they sent a delegation to COP27 for the climate talks in Egypt is a first, right? So Secretary Berger sent a delegation with herself to participate in that. So on the military side, it's becoming increasingly prevalent. They see the urgency of engaging more than the military ever has on the issue of climate security. And this is one area where a lot of veterans, and really in many ways how we got EOPA together, is when I was deployed out with the Marine Corps into the sandbox of Iraq, we came across a line of cars, trucks, and tractors really as far as the eye could see, and it was dusk, so it was very hard to see with all the sand and the haze. And as we were getting closer, we began to realize that they were lined up for the petrol station. And of course, this is Iraq during the time when there's insurgency and we were involved, and there's a curfew. And we were ordered to break up the line because you couldn't be out after a certain time. And of course, they actually rioted against us and put their own lives at risk because they were the dependence on this single source of energy. And the unfortunate thing is, when we look at worldwide now, we're doing the same thing. We're lined up to Putin's gas pump and others on dependence on the single source of energy. And unfortunately, that hasn't changed for a long, long time and still exists right now. Even the U.S., because we're a relatively large energy producer when it comes to oil and gas, we are still reliant on importing oil and gas because our refineries are designed to import the dirtiest of the oil, and we're pretty sadly good at refining that. And we export, say, the stuff in the Dakotas that you could almost put into your tank straight out of the ground. And so without billions of dollars of investment, we haven't made a new refinery since 1977, and all 6 of our LNG plants are at capacity. So we cannot actually become energy independent without billions and billions of dollars in upgrades. So we're still dependent on OPEC. And how many countries in OPEC are democracy? 0, right? OPEC plus, maybe you have 2-ish. And so if it's not Norway, the U.S., and Canada, basically you have autocratic nations controlling the single source of energy worldwide at a time when we have to increase our energy outputs. And then you have a third layer on board, which would be China. And they're taking advantage of this themselves, where guess what percentage of their Road and Belt Initiative is investing in fossil fuels when it comes to their energy investments? Any guesses? 30? Okay, we got 30. Maybe a little higher. 100%? Not quite, but cut the difference a bit, go a little higher. 75, so close. But guess what percentage of that are renewables? Close. Did someone say 1? Yeah, okay, you got it. 1% of their investment in the Road and Belt Initiative is investing in renewables externally. So while they understand that to keep the population happy and the efficiency of renewables at home sometimes, their investment is they're still making other countries dependent on these single sources of resources because they have the relationships with places like Russia and others who are supplying it so they can pull the strings. So strategically, right, this is a huge danger for the United States and other countries who care about democracy. And as a result, what happens in areas when there's dependent on a single source of energy? It's generally pretty unstable. And climate disasters are now creating more instability. To dislodge democracies in other places, you need to have instability, right? So globally, this is a pretty serious concern because now you have 53 million people displaced, and this is the first time that's double the amount in the last 10 years of people who are displaced due to conflict, and which is a huge, huge concern, right? Because when you have mass populations moving, it creates even more conflict. The area in Somalia that has the massive drought right now, is most massive drought in 40 years, that's where Al-Shabaab is the most active, right? That's one small example. I went to Bahrain. It means 2 oceans, the ocean around it and the ocean there. Now it's a drought that looks literally like Mad Max, right? If there's any place in the planet I've seen, you can see the skull and crossbones signs, the venting of the flares and everything. You could basically film the movie there. And they're the kind of the canary in the coal mine because they actually punctured their aquifer while drilling for oil and gas and making a causeway to Saudi Arabia. So bringing it kind of full cycle, you essentially have a dynamic where these choke points are able to control and influence other countries worldwide, unfortunately, where we are dependent on that pretty much and have no choice but to get off it. But what is the option to do that? Is actually offshore wind has one of the biggest potentials to do it because the amount of energy it produces in a single source of area is so amazingly there. I'll get right there. Yeah.
Real quick question.
Yeah.
On the drought in Somalia,
Yeah.
I saw a thing.
No, that definitely. Well, the problem is when you pan for gold, what do you need? Oh, interesting. As far as I'm aware, that is not working out very well. It could, I would with the caveat in some very specific local areas for very small amount. But sadly there, it's not even just Somalia, it's the whole Horn of Africa right now that's having this problem. And then you could, literally I could walk you around the world where there's a similar problems, creating these migration flows. But we don't have time, and we have to get to Ukraine too. So just summing it up though, is there is one technology that has the ability to displace the massive amounts of energy we need to electrify our transportation and buildings. 120 gigabytes worth of offshore wind off the coast of California, 40 gigabytes just off the coast of Maine. And what's the efficiency rate of offshore wind? It's in the 90s. Nuclear power plants is 92. Gas power plants have 54. Coal is 49%. Solar is 25, and onshore wind's 34. Right. So offshore wind's one of this. It's so unique in its ability to have efficiency where it's always blowing, pretty much, and the amount of energy we can bring in as long as we upgrade the grid to do so. And so that has the ability, along with solar, as the commissioner recognized earlier. Solar during the day, the wind's the strongest at night. It's a great combination. And so the more we can promote this in the U.S. and then really export this technology to Europe and other places where they're already ahead, right, particularly in Britain, it has a real potential of making our planet more secure where we're not dependent on these single sources of energy. And it's a huge, huge potential that's actually very exciting. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Igor, who has a perspective in Eastern Europe that very few of us have here.
Привет. I was born in Kiev, Ukraine. My formative years were spent foraging for mushrooms in the forest beyond Kiev with my childhood friend Ksenia, counting ducks in a pond by our family dacha, visiting my grandpa, a World War II vet himself, in Obalanka. Next slide, please. This is Obalanka today. Dante's Inferno has no stage in hell to describe this. The child on the swing set could have been me. Next slide. Shortly before the fall of the Soviet Union, though, my family fled Kiev to avoid further persecution simply for being Jewish so that I could have a better life. Next slide, please. It was from my Berkeley community on February 24th that I followed every movement of Putin's invading troops. Are you safe? I Facebook messaged my friend Kostya, glancing at my phone with sleep-deprived eyes. For now, he said, writing from a bomb shelter to which his family had just retreated. Next slide. Shortly after that, I received an email from Ksenia, who was now writing to me while fleeing Kiev herself after a rocket exploded just 100 meters away from her home. I was immobilized. What could I do from thousands of miles away? Next slide. I looked at the sign-up for the 10K coming up 2 days later, for which I'd not trained at all. The idiot that I am, I thought maybe I should sign up and use that fund to raise some funds for relief. That day became my first of many fundraising drives. Next slide. 11 months, 30 speaking engagements, 5 rallies, and $75,000 later, raised for aid, raised for relief, resistance, and resettlement efforts. At least 7 lives have been saved as a direct result of that work. Next slide. So that addresses the question of what can we do and what probably many of us in this room have been doing as individuals. But what can we do as our city, our state, our nation? Turns out even more. Next slide, please. You see, Putin's murderous war, as Alex said, has been financed by $285 million in sales of Russian oil daily. And that doesn't include all other forms of fossil fuels. Next slide. Directors like Putin make it easier for oil and gas CEOs to price gouge everyday working Americans. These executives don't care about our national security or the hardship to their consumers. They only care about one thing. And we all know what that is: money, profit. Next slide. So-called natural gas is the largest source of electricity in the U.S. It's also the heating fuel that Europe depends on a belligerent Russia to supply, and a major contributor to the climate crisis. Next slide. Last year, real energy security is only possible if we break free from oil and gas, crack down on price gouging, and invest in a cheaper, cleaner, democratized, renewable form of energy. Next slide. So last year, without any anticipation that my life would be turned upside down, just wanting to do my part to combat climate change, and with EOPA's encouragement, I transitioned from nuclear safety, which is my background, into distributed solar and battery storage. Next slide. And as a state, we lead the way in distributed generation, distributed solar and battery storage. Since 2006, we have installed actually at this point, over 1.5 million solar roofs on homes, schools, garages, farms, really anywhere where we can fit one. Next slide. That's the equivalent of getting 4 million cars off the road for 1 year, or shutting down 20 natural gas-fired power plants. And earlier this year, after months of our collective efforts on the part of all of you and EOPA as a whole, President Biden invoked the Defense Production Act to invest in this burgeoning but threatened form of energy nationally. Next slide. With a stroke of a pen, he took the first important step to ending the global scourge of fossil fuels, addressing the existential threats that we face, and putting a stop to further displacement and bloodshed. Then, he signed the Inflation Reduction Act, a historic achievement that invests $500 billion into clean energy supply chains by incentivizing domestic production in clean energy technologies and U.S.-sourced products like solar, battery storage, offshore wind, and green hydrogen, not to be confused with other forms of hydrogen that are less green. Next slide, please. Oh, and next slide after that. Now we need to leverage these historic investments and work with California's regulatory commissions like this one to ensure that they go to work for everyday Californians. And from California to Florida to Maine, we continue to fight back on utilities that wish to stop distributed generation because it threatens their rapacious energy monopoly. We cannot afford to send solar and other renewable forms of energy off a cliff. Next slide. Today is the opening of a special legislative session in California. We stand ready to support the governor's call for a windfall profits tax on oil and gas corporations, and hopefully so will our legislature, because refinery pre-scheduled maintenance is not a credible explanation for the sudden $1.54 increase per gallon in what refineries charge that Californians are forced to buy. Furthermore, the nerve of the oil companies using the war in my homeland to make exorbitant profits is inhumane. The people of Ukraine would not be suffering if Europe wasn't dependent on Russian gas. The people of California wouldn't have to decide what supplies not to buy or what to not pay, and what if it's their utility bill or their mortgage or their rent, because they have to fill up their gas tanks to get to work. For our security and the world's, we need energy independence from fossil fuels. First, we need to ensure that a windfall profit cap and rebate for consumers becomes law. The legislature must see this as a national security priority and get it done. Next slide. We owe it to our shared humanity to act decisively today. We can and must choose people over profit, choose life-affirming technologies like solar and wind over life-destroying fossil fuels, choose energy democracy over energy autocracy. I want you to get out your phones and save this number. I'm going to give you the Governor Newsom's phone number. Yeah. 916-445-2841. 916-445-2841. Thank him for holding oil and gas executives accountable and ask him to continue his climate leadership by standing up to the utility monopoly and preventing solar from being sent off a cliff. Ask him to exercise his leadership to ensure that distributed solar and battery storage can be made more affordable, not less, particularly for working class and middle class folks like the majority of the folks that we have the privilege to serve. Then make another call to your assembly member and then another call to your state senator. Tell them that you support holding oil and gas corporations accountable and send a windfall profit tax on them to the governor's desk as soon as possible. Today could be a good place to start. And then finally, call your House representative and let them know that while we supported the Investment Reduction Act, we absolutely oppose Joe Manchin's side deal, also known as a dirty fuel side deal that would simply double down on this extractive form of fossil fuel technology. And that's being snuck into the National Defense Authorization Act for a vote as early as tomorrow morning Eastern Time. So make those calls today. Next slide. In the words of my childhood friend Ksenia, who was writing to me with this line from her hiding spot, just trying to survive. Make an American dream possible for Ukraine today. Дякую, thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Igor. Now with Igor's kind of his story, you see the impact that fossil fuel and security has on a nation when you're dependent on that one source of energy. To continue talking about a nation, I'd like to pass the mic to my friend Philip of the Yurok tribe.
Good afternoon. My name is Philip Williams, Yurok tribe council member. You know, I'm a tribal fisherman. I am a father, a grandfather, a leader of my community. And in my lifetime, you know, we've been fighting the government since before I was born. The injustices that have happened to my people, I don't want to bring you guys to tears, but they have been there. And so now, in this modern age, you know, the tribe's been left behind. As you heard sort of mentioned earlier, you know, our average income on our reservation is $11,000 a year. So we also still have 50 homes on our reservation that don't have electricity. They don't have a water supply that they can depend on. The climate change has impacted our upper reservations, drying up our springs, drying up our wells. We just had a success, we're going to have the largest dam removal in American history happening on the Klamath River. That was a win for us. But what happened is those dams polluted our river. You can't drink that water now. Back in the times of my grandparents, you could drink that water, and it wouldn't hurt you. Now you can't do that anymore. You can't drink that. You can barely even swim in that water. But what I'm getting to is, with people that don't have electricity, that are running on generators, how can they afford the fuel to put in the generators at $11,000 a year? So it's not that they're getting less than. Our communities are getting none. Just think about going to your home tonight and you don't have no hot water. You can't turn on your microwave. You can't cook in your oven. And so we have elders in our community that live without electricity. We have young people, students, that have to travel 2 hours to go to school. Can't go home and take a hot shower. Can't cook a hot meal because they don't have gasoline. It's been a really extreme hardship on our communities with the price of fossil fuels going way up beyond what our families can bear. At the Yurok tribe, we've had to innovate to create revenue for our people. Our fishing is, this year's allocation was 7,000 fish for our entire tribe. Our entire tribe is 6,455 people. So that's one fish per person. Why that's significant is we're tired of being left behind. We're tired of being the afterthought. California is the fourth largest world economy, and yet we still have communities that don't have electricity. That's a terrible injustice. This economy was built on the backs of my people, the other tribes in this state. The blood from my ancestors what built this economy of California. And I think I don't want to make you guys feel bad, but that's the truth. That's the reality of where we're at today. What we're trying to do is to create ecotourism on the Klamath River, where we offer canoe trips and canoe tours. We have a wonderful hotel, very modest casino. People don't come to gamble, but they come to see our scenery. They come to see the wildlife. They come to see our community. And it's kind of amazing to know that people come to see us. They want to see the Yurok people. So we've created these new innovative ideas to depend on tourism. But tourists don't come if the fuel prices are too high. That hurts us. And we have nothing left. Offshore wind is something that we're really high on, because it's not that extractive like fossil fuels are. It's not going to be damaging our water sources that are already depleted. We just need to find some mitigation to get past our ceremonial sites, the protection of our animals. I'm really excited to work with some environmental groups. I grew up in the 70s, and so one of the things in my lifetime that I've noticed is Native peoples get along really good with environmentalists, people that protect the environment and people that protect the animals, because we think the same. You know, we're about the preservation of the land. You know, at the Yurok tribe, we've talk about our introduction of our California condor, a species that was extinct from our lands. And we had a group of people that pursued that, all the hoops they had to jump through, and now an extinct animal is going to fly in our territory once again. So it almost mirrors the resurrection of the Yurok people. We're being lifted up again. We're being recognized. I'm really excited to be here, to have this platform, to speak about these issues. We're very, very hopeful of offshore wind, what the possibilities of what it could bring, workforce development. You know, it could impact our suicide rates. We have high suicide rates because of the hopelessness and the trauma that our people have endured. And then there's no resources, there's no jobs for them to have. One of the things that we want to pursue is workforce training on our lands to give our people hope. Some of the things you people in this room take for granted, that you have a nice car, you have a home, you don't have to worry about your balance of your bank account when you go buy groceries. There's people in my community that have to put things back when they go to the grocery store. And so we're very, very hopeful that offshore wind meets our needs. We need to, you know, America was built on independence, right? I look at offshore wind as a modern version of the Boston Tea Party, to get away from the fossil fuels. These people that are controlling us, that aren't in America, that are controlling your income, controlling what you can do from half the world over. We need to do something about that. You know, at the Yurok tribe, we're trying to stay ahead of the game. One of the gentlemen spoke earlier about charging stations. You know, we put charging stations on our land. We want to start converting over from a gas station to charging stations, right? Eliminate the gas stations. So we're looking at creating more of those. We're trying to create energy resiliency. You know, we are also we live in a food desert. We had food sovereignty program we're getting off the ground now. So we grow our own foods that we can distribute to our own people, also that we can sell, that we can create revenue for our people. It's no longer, we're no longer playing the poor Indian. We're making the moves to better our people for my grandchildren and their children. The decisions I'm making now are going to impact them. And so we are trying to make sure that our descendants are taken care of and that we did the right thing during this time. We want the American dream. One of the questions that I was asked, as you heard, I'm an Army veteran. How can an Army veteran go and serve a country that doesn't love him? And I'd like to answer that question today. Because we protect our homes. We protect our villages. We protect our people. Also, we were sold on the American dream. The dream that we don't see, that many of you still don't see. We still pursue that. And the only way we can get that is defend our country. We all have to do what we got to do to protect this home and our homeland. Thank you.
So I think we have some time for a few questions. But before I open the floors for that, many of you may be thinking, well, okay, the title was Energy Security. How does that connect to the conversation? I think I I want you to think of the term security. Yes, I mentioned that several of us are veterans, so that probably initially made your mind go to the Department of Defense, so our military services. But think of security in the example that both Philip and Igor gave. The ability for you to actually go to sleep or have the security in knowing that you can provide a home for your family, you can provide food for your family. That's security, that flexibility, that ability to know that, hey, I am not living paycheck to paycheck or moment to moment. So it may seem like a long stretch, but I want you to think of the term of security and as more than just the Department of Defense or our military armed services. That ability for you to provide for your family day in and day out. So that's the security that is connected to the energy security, and not being dependent on one source of energy that is, as Philip pointed out and Alex pointed out, controlled by someone who is hundreds of thousands of miles away that cares nothing about you. The fight we're in today is for America and other countries who are being controlled by these oligarchs that control that one source of energy we become dependent on. So again, open it up to questions from the floor, from the audience. Please love to have them. So.
We did have a question from online, which was, given obviously overseas oil threats, that's one thing for national security, but how does oil and fossil fuels that are powering our energy grid at home, domestically produced, how is that a threat to national security, and how would renewable energy help?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have been reading just over the last couple of days. There was an attack, I think, in North Carolina on its energy infrastructure, and this is actually what I didn't realize. I was growing up the first time it happened, but this is the second time there was a case of what could be considered domestic terrorism. It was an attack on our energy system. We're seeing the use of energy warfare right now, thousands of miles away in Ukraine as well. Literally, that is Putin's objective, to take out as many central heating, cooling, HVAC, critical care systems, which is easy for him to do, unfortunately, because it's all centralized. So decentralized energy, democratized renewable energy, actually strengthens the grid. And we have seen here in California time and time again the way that these distributed energy resources, which are, the technical name for them is behind the meter, because you get to own and control what they do, not the utility. Distributed energy resources were able to save our grid and protect it from vulnerabilities time and time again. Most notably, this summer, there were 2 days when we were within a few gigawatts of achieving a condition that would have caused a blackout condition across the grid. It was the use of, for those consumers, these were residential and commercial consumers, schools, nonprofits, and everyday people that wanted to help and had a battery system. They were able to export the energy that their battery had produced through their rooftop solar system. And if you look at the analysis that the commission did after, it was the Public Utilities Commission that did the analysis after that, there was an almost point-to-point comparison between the number of megawatts that were imported back to the grid at that point in time, and the megawatts within which we came from having a situation where the power would go out. And I don't think I need to explain to anyone how much dependency there is on our grid to power critical life systems on which people depend on. So we cannot achieve our own statewide California goals without both utility scale and demand side or distributed scale, smaller scale solar. So what that means is any time that PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, and SoCal Edison claim that they know what's best for the community and co-opt equity reasons that attack distributed energy resources, it actually hurts them in the long term. But because they make money off of the number of transmission lines that they put in, and they get a guaranteed profit of 8 to 12% a year from that, it's very similar to the fossil fuel monopoly, same type of reward structure for them. Because of that, in the short term, they are trying to slash solar, distributed solar. In the long term, they are going to, all of us are actually going to suffer from those decisions. And that's why it is so critical that we need to keep our solar growing. The California Public Utilities Commission will be deciding on new rules for net energy metering on December 15th. So we literally have 10 days to call the governor and call the California Public Utilities Commission and say, don't send solar off a cliff. Don't make it twice as expensive as it is now to be able to afford a rooftop solar system. Don't put the majority of the people adopting it now that have to finance it, don't put them underwater, which is what the new proposal would do. Make it more affordable, not less, for working class and middle class folks, and thereby enhance the security of the entire grid system.
Just to quickly add that the Department of Defense has a plan by 2035, every base has to have a micro and smart grid. So they've already seen the vulnerabilities to the grid system, and as long as we are producing and using the gas and oil to produce our electricity, we're feeding into the problem internationally. Because if we're not getting off of it and pursuing the technologies to do that, we're still perpetuating the larger problem where everyone else and ourselves are dependent on a single source of energy. So we've got to leave it. And in fact, if we don't get off it, we're making ourselves even more vulnerable because we're dependent. And if everyone else starts to advance on this and we're left by ourselves, even the supply chain issues on that are tremendously harmful and security risks. This is one thing EOPA is focusing on, and we're going to be urging the administration to use the Defense Production Act to invest $350 billion to upgrade our grid system so we can take in the energy from offshore wind and other places like that. And additionally, we'll be working, and we are working with the Environment Minister for Ukraine, the members of Parliament in the UK, and Congress here to do a Green Marshall Plan in Ukraine, so they can bypass building petrol stations and go straight to putting charging stations, for instance. So these are plans that EOPA are working on in the federal and international realm. But it really goes back to California because what happens here as almost the fourth largest economy in the world, creeping up on Germany there, it really does lead the world, right? What we have set here for car standards is the baseline for the rest of the U.S. So when we can successfully do this in California, it can be the example for how we rebuild in other places, including Ukraine and Somalia and others, to effectively do that.
Hey, we have a couple questions over here.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a tribal nations perspective about security. As long as there's fossil fuels, tribal nation is not secure. They're always trying to put pipelines across our land, which jeopardize our water sources. And so we always have to be on guard when the government tries to exercise its plenary powers over tribal nations, which means they can do whatever they want to us if it's in the best interest of America. And so that's how they always put these oil lines, drilling, fracking on our lands. And if we can go to clean energy, that would make us in tribal nations more secure.
All right. So how can we protect the tribal nation, right? Because they're going to put these farms in the ocean. But when they start to produce the renewable energy, how can they get into that profit margin, right? Because they're going to make money. So not just to build the workforce in your land, but after that, how? Because these companies, like the auction tomorrow, you're going to have big companies bidding on those. They're going to take the profit later on. They're going to run away, right? Because we see this happening all over the world, especially in Africa, where China now is investing in Africa big time, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in getting the oil, bringing it to their shore, and then we don't have no refineries in Africa to refine that oil, that crude oil, and then they have to sell them back with double, triple costs, and that's what keep them poor. So how we can protect that investment that is going to be making there, because eventually these companies are going to be on the stock market, right? So the dividends are going to pay for the stockholders instead of you guys on the nation in the future to get a piece of that pie.
Well, we're in a favorable position right now, hopefully, and we need a position at the table. We need to be in the decision-making process. We've seen this extraction happen with gold, right? They come and destroy our environment, take a whole mountain down in a few days for the gold, and then leave. We're cleaning up the mess today. We're doing river restoration to clean up the mining messes that were happened in the 1800s. Now we have the timber industry came in, took our land, cut all of our trees down, except for what you see on the highway, the parks. All the old growth, thousands of years old trees are gone. And then here we are cleaning up the mess again. They left the tribal nations the job to clean it up. And we were happily to do it, because now we get to create it in a way the Creator taught us. What we're asking for is a place at the table, to be respected. We want to be at the table. And that's going to be the way that we have to move forward, because we cannot let this, you hear me talk about the playbook. We've seen this before. And the fact, the red flag for me personally is we talk about our natural resources have already been extracted, so now we're a vulnerable community. So a company comes in with these big promises and big dollars and big checkbook, and they mesmerize you. And then they come and they take from you. Then whatever happens, we don't know, 20 years, 50 years, but we're going to have to clean up the mess.
Yeah, my question was partially answered when you said that our military bases are starting to create their own microgrids to not be dependent on the larger grids. So in terms of security, because all of our microgrids are run by computer systems, which can be easily abused by hackers, it seems that the solution would be what the military bases are doing, which is to create microgrids for the community so that we don't have one large system. And in terms of our native brothers, it seems that the reservations would be a great place to begin experimenting on creating these microgrids to see how well they work in many communities. So why aren't we moving in that direction?
That's actually a really, really good point. It's absolutely true that when we have distributed micro and smart grids, one or two could go down there, but it's tremendously intensive effort to try to take all of them down, right? Whereas the current system we have right now, I used to sit on the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee, and it's actually pretty scary to see how vulnerable it is right now. Some of these are just unmarked buildings that control a quarter of the nation's flow of electricity, and extremely vulnerable. They can pack them up and take it out in a couple briefcases and set up another place if that got compromised. But the securities on the cyber side they've got to improve this. With that too, backing up a small step, in Standing Rock, there's an interesting model, a partnership with Justice Capital, where the tribal nation has actually ownership in the turbines. A little easier when you have onshore wind because it's literally on the land versus offshore where it's in federal waters. So there are models like that which are pretty exciting, I think. Sir?
Checking on the idea about why don't we just set up these microgrids for California, America,
or I love a microphone. It just reminded me of when I was on the Santa Cruz City Council way back in the day when like Dom and I first met. I can neither confirm nor deny that I was part of a briefing where, because Santa Cruz has the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk, and because it occurred a couple years after 9/11, all of a sudden we were able to apply for some kind of a strategic funding for like energy and containment because the beach boardwalk was considered a high, whatever, profile target defense-wise. And of course we were like, yes, we'll take the money, like whatever it is so that we can build whatever. So just along those lines, I mean, it's probably already been thought of, but that would be some sort of creative policy to pursue. Say, well, if we're not going to get all the communities, let's start with the high-profile target ones. I know it's the classic, metropolitan. I mean, you see it in movies, right? We're under attack. Oh, Chicago, Dallas, New York. Like, I get it, but I think that within our communities there is specific high-profile targets, and then we can. Anyway, you get my point. So just piggybacking on his comment.
This is why we love putting these summits on, because we get these ideas and we can feed them up. And we actually have a mechanism to do that where we have a task force with the Department of Energy. And within that task force, there are working groups that align with the different departments within the DOE and Department of Transportation. So, for instance, one of them is they've stood up a new state and local department within the Department of Energy to focus on how we can get the funding from the IRA and the Infrastructure Act and the CHIPS Act out there to the communities. They are looking at how to rate it in some ways, but how to do that effectively and into the Justice 40 communities is going to be something they need input from the lawmakers in the communities. So getting your input in on this to the task force and the working groups is really important. So start with the tribal side and the Department of Energy. We have a tribal rep as well working on that, which Philip, you're on.
And so I just want to say, and one of the things that the city said is, we'll take the money. We said, how many blocks away from the boardwalk can we cover, like, with all this Fed money? Like, we were just trying to get as much of the city covered as possible. So, like, they totally, like, go block by block or whatever.
We do have to, unfortunately, wrap for the next panel.
Okay. I'll be quick. Just the policy implications right now, microgrids, the opportunity to have them is one of the most exciting things happening. The utilities have been, to the shock of maybe no one, very resistant. Because again, microgrids means that's less guaranteed profit for them. And we saw this play out earlier this year in the legislature. There was a bill that would have incentivized microgrids. The utilities and their powerful allies introduced poison pill language. And then at that point, we had to stop that bill. We stopped it by one vote 3 times. Thankfully, I think that this is where the power of communities really shines. Sonova just applied. They used an obscure portion of the energy code and has a proceeding before the CPUC right now to apply to be a micro utility, which basically would be applying for power grid. We have a bill that was signed around community solar. That proceeding is starting early next year, and we're going to be tracking that. So I think the bottom line is it makes so much sense to decentralize. It makes so much sense to put democratized renewable energy in the hands of we the people. We just need to make sure on behalf of the communities that we represent that the governor, the legislature, and the Public Utilities Commission, as well as the Energy Commission, hears from all of you.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank our panel. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insightful work.